Ladies and gentlemen, may I request the couple of people at the back who are still standing to be seated. Honorable Mr. Kevin Rudd, Member of Parliament from Australia, former Prime Minister, former Foreign Minister, and above all, a distinguished analyst of China, which is why you are here this evening, not just as the former Prime Minister of Australia, but as someone who is regarded around the world as an authority, knowledgeable about Australia. I can tell you, a couple of months back, Mr. Rudd spoke in London at the International Institute of Strategic Studies, offering a brilliant analysis of the leadership transition in China, which is what prompted me to invite him to come to Mumbai. He's going from here to Brookings, around the United States, and celebrating his Christmas in China after having spoken about China around the world. I'm delighted that each one of you could make it this evening. Some of you were here at our first IISS Oberoi lecture and therefore are aware of this initiative. The International Institute of Strategic Studies is a truly international institution based in London. It's truly international because it is now funded internationally. Most of its funding comes from around the world, from the United States, from Europe, from Asia, including from India. And in India, among the half a dozen corporates who have already become our members, one of them is the Oberoi Group, and therefore we are delighted that we have this alliance with the Oberoi in India to have initiated the IISS Oberoi lecture. Our other offices are in Washington, D.C., Singapore, and Bahrain. I am Sanjay Baru. I head the Geoeconomics and Strategy program of the IISS. And the Geoeconomics and Strategy program was conceived in the aftermath of the transatlantic financial crisis in 2008, by which time it had become clear that not only was the rise of China, much of East Asia, and India owing to the superb economic performance of these economies, of these countries, but also the relative decline of the West, particularly Europe, was also because of the economic problems, including demographic shifts confronting the developed economies, whether it's Japan in the East or Western Europe in the West. And these long-term economic trends, demographic shifts, shifts in the production centers, in growth engines, we believe are having a long-term impact on geopolitics and political relationship between countries. So it's this interface between what's happening in the field of economics, with what's happening with respect to business and the financial sector on the one hand, and the impact that that has had on the power of nations, both their political influence as well as their military power, their ability to project, to intervene. It's this interface that the Geoeconomics and Strategy program has chosen to focus on. Here at the Oberoi, we've had the opportunity of bringing the president of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, who himself is a distinguished geoeconomist, having worked on Wall Street and then in the US government, to speak to a small group of some of our members on his view of what's happening in the world. And then we had the public lecture by Klaus Regling, the CEO of the European Financial and Stability Facility, who spoke on the euro and the future of Europe. And then we've had the opportunity of hosting another small private dinner for our members here at the Oberoi with Tharman Shanmugaratnam, the Deputy Prime Minister and the Finance Minister of Singapore. This is our fourth event, the second public event, and the fourth program of the IISS in Mumbai. And we are delighted to welcome Mr. Rudd to come and speak to a very distinguished gathering of people who have interest in business, in international affairs, and in strategic issues. Mr. Rudd will speak about the leadership transition in China And he speak for about 30-35 minutes, and is very happy to take questions. I'll invite you to ask questions or intervene and comment on whatever he has to say. We want to keep this as a more of an intellectual exchange, so that each one of you go back with ideas in your mind and are tempted to return to our next event, because our entire attempt has been to provide a platform for a stimulating conversation with those of you who are in the field of business, banking, and public affairs in Mumbai, and internationally renowned experts on international affairs. With these words, I welcome all of you once again and invite Mr. Rudd to speak.
Thank you very much, Sanjaya, for that kind welcome, and it's wonderful to be back here in India and wonderful to be back here in Mumbai. And thank you for your kind references to my earlier political incarnations. In my second most recent career adjustment, when I moved from the position of Prime Minister to Foreign Minister, I happened to go to Beijing. I was opening an exhibition there at the Red Lantern Gallery, owned by an Australian, on the old Ming Wall, what's left of it, at least, in one corner of the city. As I arrived there, the Chinese media had heard about my recent career adjustment, and they asked me in Chinese, 陆克文先生你还活着, which, for those of you who speak Chinese, it translates into English a little bit like this. This is live Chinese television. Kevin, you're alive. Which, when you think about it, is a very interesting question to be posed by someone from the Chinese political environment, and an interesting reflection as well on some of the rigours of internal Chinese political life. So I then told them live on television a story. I said, well, I began as the son of a farmer. I became interested in China. I studied Chinese at university. And then, because no one else would employ me, I joined the Australian Foreign Service. Having joined the Australian Foreign Service, I then went to work on the China desk, and following being on the China desk, I eventually ended up as First Secretary in our embassy in Beijing. I went back to Australia, and I went and became the private secretary to one of the state premiers in Australia in Queensland. And then eventually I became a member of the House of Representatives in Australian politics. And then I became the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and then I became the Leader of the Opposition. And then I became the Prime Minister. And now I've become the Foreign Minister. And on my current career trajectory, I'll soon be back on the China desk in the Australian Foreign Service. By way of explanation, why we may be spending Christmas in Beijing is my daughter and her Australian husband live there, and we have a brand new granddaughter, and that's where they'll be in Beijing. And for those of you with grandchildren, I think you understand the importance of being together. For my lecture this evening, there will be a version online soon. When I hear the word lecture, I always wonder what that means. Remarks are one thing and address is something else. A lecture, I'm automatically taken back to Oxbridge formalities. I was recently at the Oxford China Centre when I said, well, how long would you like me to speak? They said the standard hour, followed by an hour and a half of questioning. If I did that at an Australian university, there'd be a palace revolt, a coup, and it could be violent and bloody. So you'll be pleased to know I have prepared an hour-long lecture, but you'll be even more pleased to know that I don't intend to read it to you. It will be online, and it will examine some of the arguments may unfold in a little more detail. So if later this evening you're suffering from acute insomnia, you know which website to go to. It'll be either mine or on the IISS. Well, I thank the International Institute for Strategic Studies for their kind invitation to deliver this Oberoi lecture here in India. The IISS has a long and distinguished history in bringing analytical and policy focus to the great strategic challenges of our time. And it's appropriate that this lecture series be delivered in India, given this country's significance in the evolution of the current global and regional order. It is my privilege to be Prime Minister in 2009 and again as Foreign Minister last year. And Prime Minister Gillard, of course, concluded a successful visit here most recently. In 2009, we agreed for the first time to frame this relationship as a strategic partnership. This was not an idle term. It reflected the fact that we, Australia and India, have so many fundamental interests and values in common as we approach foreign policy complexities in the current century. Historical impediments in the relationship between our two countries have been dealt with. FTA negotiations are now underway, but if we are to make the most of this future relationship, we, that's India and Australia, must work together to unlock its economic potential. Australia is the 12th largest economy in the world, a member of the G20 together with India. We are the 4th largest economy in Asia after China, Japan and India. There is much business therefore to be done as we transform this relationship, Australia and India, from the old and perhaps a little too distant relationship beyond the cricket playing field of the past into a dynamic relationship for the future across all levels, strategic, economic and political. We in Australia see ourselves as a middle power with both regional and global interests. We pursue an active diplomacy regionally and globally, and we look forward to working continuously with our friends here in New Delhi and in all the major councils of the world with India. I note that the specific space which the Oberoi lecture seeks to occupy in our crowded international agenda is to make sense both in analysis and policy of the great geo-economic developments of the 21st century. Some may argue that geo-economic analysis occupies an uncertain terrain between the more defined certitudes of geopolitics on the one hand and geostrategic analysis on the other. Within the academy, there are some parallels with the emergence over the last 30 years of IPE, International Political Economy, as a recognised discipline occupying a necessary but nonetheless contested conceptual space between the more established disciplines of international relations and economics. A core task of foreign policy in the 21st century is to make analytical sense of international economics, international security and international politics in an age of globalisation where literally everything is connected to everything else. And based on integrated analysis, to make proactive policy recommendations to our respective governments on how to best maintain the stability of the post-war international order while at the same time managing the individual policy challenges of the day. I've long said that the beginning of wisdom in foreign policy is first to understand the interests and values and identity of others. Second, to understand with equal clarity the interests, values and sense of identity that we have ourselves. And then, based on 1 and 2 above, maximise cooperation, minimise conflict and manage the rest. Or as His Excellency Shyam Saran noted recently in his provocative lecture, China in the 21st Century, What India Needs to Know About China's Worldview, he quoted another scholar who said the following: "To see ourselves as others see us is a valuable gift without doubt. But in international relations, what is rarer and far more useful is to see others as they see themselves." I could not agree more wholeheartedly. For it is on this core question of mindsets that I would like to focus my remarks today, on one of the central questions of our age, namely the rise of China and the response of the United States, the West and the rest, including this great civilization, this nation, this emerging economy that is India. So let us all be clear, the rise of China is no ordinary event. It is in fact an extraordinary event, and one which has materialised literally before our eyes over the last 30 years, almost a nanosecond within the vast context and canvas of human history. When in the course of the next decade the Chinese economy surpasses the United States in aggregate size, this will be the first time since George III that a non-English speaking, non-Western, non-democratic state will be the largest economy in the world. This is already having a profound effect both on the objective reality and subjective perceptions that characterise contemporary international relations. Not only is the centre of geo-economic gravity shifting from North America and Europe to Asia, or from a maritime perspective from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific, so too is the centre of geopolitical and geostrategic gravity shifting to this Asian hemisphere as well. The axiom where economic power goes, political and strategic power soon follows, continues to exhibit its own intrinsic and rigorous logic. That is not to dismiss the power of ideas, of values and of identity, for these too continue to shape the way in which we think and act. I, for one, have never believed that there is anything determinist about history. I believe that ideas matter. I believe that policy, including foreign policy, matters. I also believe that policy, including foreign policy, matters, just as I believe that politics matters in providing the capacity to translate policy into reality. So therefore, when our friends in China and our friends here in India, together with those of us in Australia, look at the great changes unfolding before us, I believe our analysis should be clear and our foreign policy bold in seeking to realise our common objectives of ensuring the continued peace, prosperity and unfolding freedoms so fundamental to the future of this Asian hemisphere. This brings us to the core question of China's new political leadership and the prospects for policy continuity and change. I've been writing on China's leadership transition now over the last 3 months, and its implications for the Chinese economy, Chinese political reform, and the future shape of Chinese foreign and security policy. But something particularly significant happened last weekend, of which we should all take note. In his first travel outside Beijing, officially, since being elected General Secretary and Chairman of the Military Commission at the 18th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party just last month, Xi Jinping chose to travel to Shenzhen. Shenzhen, just across the border from Hong Kong, has a particular significance within the Chinese political and economic policy mindset. It was here during the early 1980s that Deng Xiaoping unveiled the first of China's then 4 special economic zones, which became the national and international symbols of Deng's determination to internationalise the Chinese economy and to implement a vast program of market-based economic reforms. Significantly, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Jinping, himself a revolutionary hero within the annals of the People's Liberation Army, also took a leading role in promoting the Shenzhen economic experiment 30 years ago. Xi Jinping is enormously proud of his father's achievements, and of course Xi Jinping himself experienced the personal impact of his father's fall from political grace and then subsequent rehabilitation with Deng. Over the weekend, Xi Jinping placed a wreath at a statue of Deng Xiaoping. He's also reported to have stated the following, I quote, "The decision the party's central leadership made about opening and reform was correct. Hereafter we will still go down this correct road. We must unswervingly take the road of enriching the nation, enriching the people, but we must also open it up even further." For students of modern Chinese political history, Xi Jinping's remarks and where he chose to make them are of particular political significance in providing a critical insight into the priorities of his new leadership. Not only was Xi Jinping saying that both Deng Xiaoping and his father Xi Jinping got it right way back in the late 70s and early 80s, Xi Jinping was also deliberately commemorating another famous event in Chinese politics, Deng Xiaoping's famous Southern expedition, when as an 88-year-old, a spring chicken by Chinese terms, 3 years after the political implosions at Tiananmen Square in 1989 and the conservative political reaction that followed, Deng made a public political point of returning to Shenzhen, the symbolic cornerstone of the post-1978 economic reform program, to pronounce both to China and the international community that the Chinese economic reform program had to proceed even faster than before. The significance will not be lost on anyone in Chinese politics that 20 years later, almost to the month, Xi Jinping, on his first official visit within the country, has elected not only to go to Shenzhen, but also to emulate Deng's 1992 declaration by stating today that not only was Deng right back then, but China must now open up even further. Xi's visit to the South is also sending a message not just about policy substance, but also about political style. Xi's visit was not covered extensively by Chinese central television. Instead, his remarks were carried by the Hong Kong-based Phoenix television network, which has massive reach across China's political elites, but also a broader audience as well. They were also covered extensively by China's exploding social media, with photographs and comments widely circulated in the Chinese Twitter sphere and blogosphere. Xi also chose not to travel in a limousine, but instead by minibus. And most significantly in the eyes of the long-suffering Chinese commuters, Xi insisted that the traffic not be blocked while he travelled around Shenzhen, as has almost always occurred in the past with provincial visits by central Chinese leaders. It is clear that at a level of political style that Xi Jinping is determined to cut a different, less elitist image. So what sort of man is Xi Jinping? And what sort of leader is he likely to be? And what are the other newly elected members of the 7-member Standing Committee? Much has been written about Xi Jinping. It has been my privilege to spend some time with Mr. Xi and on different occasions with 5 of the other 7 members of the newly announced Standing Committee. By the way, our Consul General here in Mumbai, Steve Waters, a friend and colleague of mine from the Foreign Service, accompanied Xi Jinping on a special visits program visit to Australia back in 1988. He has met him too in an earlier incarnation. I first met him in 1986 when he was Vice Mayor of Xiaoping in Fujian Province. Many people ask me what leaders like Xi Jinping and those around him are like as both politicians and human beings. My general response is they're just like the rest of us, who have been associated with national political leadership during our careers. These are normal human beings confronted with the normal challenges of life, confronted with the abnormal, infinite expectations of what they can deliver at the same time, confronted with finite resources in order to meet those expectations. In their case, however, that's China's leadership, they additionally confront the extraordinary challenge of negotiating the continued economic transformation of the most populous country on earth, and doing so within the rigidities of a political system that is still dominated by a Leninist state. On balance, my judgment is that this new Chinese leadership team is both sufficiently politically powerful and certainly technically competent to meet the formidable tasks which lie before it. The new leadership team is on balance reformist in terms of the future direction of Chinese economic policy, while remaining what I would describe as small c conservative on the possibilities of further political reform within the Chinese system. As for Xi Jinping himself, I believe Xi Jinping to be experienced, confident and self-assured, and because of his family's political pedigree, comfortable with the mantle of political leadership. I believe Xi Jinping is confident of both his military and his economic reformist credentials, based on his father's achievements in both domains, as well as Xi Jinping's own period in the PLA and his position as private secretary to former Defence Minister Geng Biao. As I've long said, I believe Xi Jinping is a Chinese leader that the Americans can do business with if they so choose on both sides. Not just in shaping the long-term contours of Sino-US relations in a new constructive strategic direction, but also in shaping the broad architecture of a new based security order for Asia. And on top of this, it is significant that the Party Congress appointed Xi Jinping immediately as chairman of the Central Military Commission. His appointment now to take over the position represents a break in convention 10 years ago, when his predecessor Hu Jintao had to wait another 2 years to be appointed chairman of the Military Commission, because his predecessor Jiang Zemin chose to remain in that position for a further 2 years. That has not occurred with Xi Jinping. In overall terms, Xi Jinping, while acknowledging and accepting the realities of collective leadership decision-making processes, I believe he has the capacity to become more than a primus inter pares, first among equals. I do not believe it is within his temperament to simply be content with the policy status quo. He has considerable political capital to draw on, but the key question is what domestic and international policy direction he will seek to take the country as of now. So what are the priorities of this new leadership? The first priority of the new leadership team is the further reform of the economy in the context of a weakened global economy over the last 5 years, and also facing limited prospects for rapid global economic recovery to previous growth levels. China knows it must now change its economic growth model from one that has served it well for the last 30 years to one which will sustain it over the next 30. In the 12th five-year plan, the Chinese recognise that the old growth model, based on low wages, labour-intensive manufacturing for export, made possible by high levels of state investment, underpinned in turn by high levels of domestic savings, has already reached its use-by date in China's coastal provinces and is working its way westwards across China's central provinces and to Sichuan in the west. The leadership has concluded that the new growth model should be based instead of high levels of domestic consumption, lower savings, more generous government safety nets, the rapid expansion of the services sector to meet China's equally rapid urbanisation process, as well as greater opportunities for private capital. I believe that new Chinese leadership may well embrace the following new economic policy directions. we are likely to see further market reforms of the Chinese economy. I believe we'll see reforms to China's state-owned enterprises and the possible privatisation of some. I believe we'll see reforms to the Chinese financial services industry and a greater ability for Chinese private enterprises to have easier and more competitive access to finance to sustain and expand their operations. I believe we'll also see further reforms to the Chinese currency markets, which over time is likely to make Chinese imports more competitive within their domestic market. Many have asked the obvious question, what are the prospects then for Chinese political reform? My own belief is that if Xi Jinping's leadership successfully prosecutes the formidable economic transformation tasks described above during his first term, then the leadership may embrace a form of small p political reform during his second five-year term between 2017 and 2022. Oh, for the political predictability of the Chinese political system. None of us should forget that 2021 is an important year in Chinese political history, as it will mark the centenary of the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party. In the lead up to 2021, the question will increasingly be asked within the Chinese intellectual debate and broader political discussion as to whether the historical mission of this revolutionary party has been fulfilled, and whether the time for gradual political transformation to a new political model has therefore come. History matters in Chinese politics. Anniversaries matter in Chinese politics. Historical analogies matter in Chinese politics. Under Mao's leadership, the task was to unite the country. Under Deng's leadership, it has been to economically transform the country in order to return China to its historical position as a great power both within the region and the world. Under Xi Jinping's leadership, will it be his mission to complete the economic transformation process, raise China to sustainable middle-income status, and entrench China's position within the world order, but beyond that also to transform Chinese politics as well? Taiwan may well have an important role to play in this regard. If Taiwan were to propose at some stage over the next decade to execute a form of political confederation with the mainland, a sort of one country, three systems approach, then the democratising forces which could be further unleashed from Taiwan's own successful democratic experiment could become formidable across the mainland. These reflections may seem fanciful to many, but there is already a quiet internal discussion within both political establishments on both sides of the Taiwan Straits as to what the political future may look like should both sides of the Taiwan Strait come together in some form of political condominium. This leaves, of course, to one side the domestic drivers of political change within China itself, including the rise of the private sector, the rise of Chinese NGOs, and the explosion in the Chinese social media world, where ultimately no single agency of the Chinese state is able to exercise comprehensive control. The challenge, therefore, for the party is how to manage these processes of long-term political transformation, rather than contemplating either a repeat of Tiananmen and a disaster like that on an even greater scale, or for that matter the reverse, an Arab Spring or colour revolution that actually prevails. No one should underestimate the capacity of China's formidable security forces to maintain political control. But the China of 2021 is likely to be vastly different to the China of 1989, just as the China of 2012 is vastly different from the China of 1989. This raises the question of what type of political reform may be contemplated within Chinese politics during Xi Jinping's second term. And on this, I have no specific factual basis for the following prognostications, but simply some idle reflections. Beyond the party itself, much discussion has occurred in relation to making the PLA, the army, answerable to the apparatus of the state rather than to the party. I believe this debate is fraught with political tension and controversy at this time. Then there is a debate on the role of the National People's Congress, China's appointed parliament, and its greater role in the scrutiny of government decisions and the regularisation and institutionalisation of the NPC's policy committee structures. The NPC is also slowly beginning to develop its own sense of institutional identity, which is useful for any fundamental political transformation process in the future. Nonetheless, I believe it's possible that the first area we may see signs of political change will not be in the National People's Congress, but will be in relation to China's so-called advisory parliament, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC. The CPPCC, and there's an award after this lecture for those who can say that 10 times rapidly without stumbling over it. The CPPCC includes within its ranks members of China's 8 so-called democratic parties from the pre-1949 period. The CPPCC also played a core historic role in legitimising the coming to power of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949, when it was convened as a type of People's Convention or Constitutional Convention. To this day, the CPPCC also has a defined constitutional role in providing advice both to the government and the party on the administration of the Chinese state. I have no factual evidence on which to base this observation, but I do believe it's possible that one significant step in the Chinese political reform process would be to begin to elect the CPPC in whole or in part through universal democratic franchise. Conservatives would argue that this would be the straw that broke the camel's back and would represent an unnecessary concession of political power by a revolutionary party. Liberals, on the other hand, would critique such a move as too little to make any real difference. It may, however, be one possible way in which the Chinese leadership begins to demonstrate to the Chinese people that a managed process of political transformation to a more contestable democracy is underway. At this point, it's important to withdraw our gaze from the crystal ball. But I do note, having studied China now for 35 years, that change does occur in this country, and it can occur rapidly, and it can occur in a highly planned manner as well. And it's important that we're alert to these possibilities. I'm always, however, mindful of the great admonition of Zhou Enlai in his response to the famous question of a journalist when asked what was the significance of the French Revolution, and his reported and most elegant response that it was simply far too early to tell. So therefore, none of this protracted discussion on the possibilities of Chinese political reform should distract us or cause us to underestimate the formidable domestic policy challenges that the new Chinese leadership will confront as they seek to implement this next phase of economic reform. These include long-term energy and resource security, the imposition of carbon controls to limit environmental and economic damage to China itself, water scarcity, land management decisions giving rise to massive local protest activity, inequality between the cities and the countryside and between coastal, inland and western provinces, an increasingly open social media debate, the assault of materialism on traditional socialist values, and the rise of new religious forces and alternative belief structures. And, from Beijing's perspective, an increasingly non-benign foreign policy environment in relation to many of China's neighbours. The challenge, therefore, for Xi Jinping's new leadership will be to implement a further large-scale transformation of the Chinese economy over the next 5 years and to manage the range of other policy and political pressures that will also dominate the domestic landscape in China over those 5 years. So what of foreign policy? Will we see change? Will we see continuity? Will we see both? It is important to be clear in our own minds what China believes to be its own foreign policy priorities. Maintaining the unity of the motherland remains at the absolute core of China's foreign policy and security policy interests. These include Taiwan, Xinjiang and Tibet, as well as China's disputed territorial and maritime boundaries with various of its neighbours. China's second core foreign policy priority is driven by the economic imperative of ensuring the conclusion of the economic transformation task. A core subset of this task is China's national energy security policy and the critical strategic importance of energy pipelines and sea lines of communication. Third, and as a consequence of the second, China wishes to maintain a stable global and regional strategic and political environment so that its economic mission can be completed and not disrupted. And a subset of this is to maintain a stable, albeit competitive, relationship with the United States for the decade ahead. Fourth, consistent with its economic objective and its territorial integrity objective, China also wishes to secure a benign foreign policy environment with its immediate neighbours, and in particular with East Asia more broadly. But of course, this objective runs headlong into China's first objective, and therefore underpins much of the tension we've seen in recent times in various border disputes, from time to time with India, now with Japan, and most acutely in Southeast Asia over to the South China Sea. Relations with Vietnam, for example, are particularly fraught and should be monitored particularly closely right now. Fifth, and somewhat more opaque than the first four of these foreign and security policy objectives, is China's role in the global order. And it is here that we see the full range of China's conflicting and competing interests and values, together with those of the rest of the world, on full display. China's attitude to the current global order is worthy of some reflection. China's approach is at best ambiguous. It is neither a hardline opponent nor an enthusiastic supporter of the current global architecture, but rather simply accepts it as the reality which was dictated to the rest of the world by the Anglo-American victors of the Second World War. Nonetheless, if you were to ask a Chinese political leader, or for that matter their foreign policy think tanks, whether they have developed an alternative to the current international order, the answer by and large is no. Certainly China sees itself as possessing enormous advantages as a result of its membership of the P5. China also itself increasingly is called upon to contribute to UN peacekeeping operations, as well as being an increasingly active participant in most UN specialised agencies and the Bretton Woods institutions. But the core question facing us all as to how China sees itself, to borrow Bob Zellick's famous phrase, as a responsible global stakeholder, in sustaining and enhancing the order into the future, given the range of global pressures that the order itself currently confronts. This in turn leads to a wider discussion of what sort of global and regional great power China wants to be. We all know that after 100 years of foreign humiliation, from the Opium Wars to the Japanese occupation, the Chinese reformers of all political hues dreamt of China's national wealth and power. According to these reformers, whose careers spanned the century from the 1890s to the 1990s, if China could maintain its national unity and make its economy function, China would once again return to the glories of previous centuries in the ages of the Ming, the Tang and the Han. But the question the international community is now asking China is pretty basic. Now that you have national wealth and power, how will you choose to deploy it around the region and around the world? This is not a question about whether China is likely to invade another country or not. China has very little history of this, and virtually none compared with the United States and the European colonial powers in previous centuries. But this is a straw man argument. The real question is how China would seek to exercise its foreign and security policy influence across the wider region and the world more broadly. My own view is that China has yet to develop an agreed internal national script on this question. Much analytical work is underway within China itself on this subject, but it is still very much an open-ended question. Importantly, therefore, for the rest of the world and the rest of the region, in the period ahead, there remains, I believe, a window of opportunity, which is temporary, in which to engage our Chinese friends on what sort of cooperative future we can imagine together with the Chinese within the 21st century global and regional order. This is a time, therefore, for ideas, for policy creativity and for fresh conceptual thinking, albeit within the framework of a multilateral rules-based order which broadly has served us well since the end of the Second World War. In the meantime, however, in the absence of definitive Chinese statements about their view of their future global and regional role, once they emerge as the world's largest economy, most probably during Xi Jinping's presidency, and given the significant continuing expansion of China's military, it is almost inevitable that the rest of the region and the rest of the world will hedge their bets on what sort of China we're all likely to face in the future. I, for one, am an optimist about our ability to escape the determinist forces of history and through innovative political leadership in relevant capitals begin to craft a common cooperative future for us all. This means fully engaging the globalising China that we've seen emerge over the last 30 years. But the rest of the world is equally attentive to nationalist forces also alive in Chinese politics, and for that matter in other regional polities as well, and will therefore, in their foreign and security policies, hedge against the possibility of more negative security outcomes. To conclude my remarks on China-US relations and the future of the Asia-Pacific region, the Pacific-Indian Ocean region. Last month we saw President Obama's re-election for the next 4 years, and we saw President Xi's appointment for the next 5. I believe this presents a unique opportunity for the US and China to begin to forge a new strategic roadmap capable of guiding us through the many shoals that lie ahead for all of us. The Obama administration has laid down some fundamental pillars in its future engagement, both with China in particular and the Asian hemisphere in general. At the military level, the administration has executed its rebalance to Asia. Diplomatically, the administration has further entrenched its regional engagement in Asia by becoming a full member of the East Asian Summit, together with India, together with Australia. Economically, the administration has backed the enhancement of the Trans-Pacific Partnership to include the major economies of the region, including Japan, as well as prospectively leaving the door ajar for China as well. Despite some friction with these various measures, the overall strategic settings for US policy engagement in Asia have now been put in place, and by and large they have been responded to positively across most of the region. So the question arises, what must now be done? I argue that President Obama and President Xi need to outline a new 5-year US strategic roadmap. In the absence of such a strategic roadmap, there is always a danger of strategic drift. Further, I'd recommend 5 elements for such a roadmap for the future. First, President Xi and President Obama must meet regularly with all the key members of their respective staff. These individuals need to become highly familiar with each other, as occurred in the days of the Soviet Union and the then Reagan administration. At present, their staffs by and large do not know each other with that level of familiarity. Second, it's important also that both President Xi and President Obama need to have an undisputed point person to be the ultimate go-to person on the relationship. At the US end, this should mean the National Security Advisor or a senior official within the NSC who can speak comfortably across the administration and with authority. At this critical juncture of US-China relations, America needs the next Henry Kissinger for all the back-channeling that is necessary both behind and between official presidential meetings. Similarly, China needs to appoint such a person as well. The Chinese system does not have a National Security Council. China needs one, and needs one soon. Third, the US and China should embark on a realistic program to make the current global rules-based order work. Increasingly, our order does not work. We're all familiar with the impasses over Syria. They're not likely to be resolved anytime soon. But other critical blockages in the UN system, Doha, climate change, etc., do remain to be resolved, and between them, China and the US have a capacity to demonstrate that the rules-based order can work and deliver real results. Furthermore, a new period of Sino-US strategic cooperation would also make the G20 work more effectively, given the complex array of global financial and global macroeconomic challenges that lie before us. Fourth, a new US-China strategic roadmap should embrace the principles of how to build a new rules-based security order for East Asia. This is what I've described elsewhere as developing the principles of a new Pax Pacifica, which is neither a new Pax Americana or a new Pax Sinica by some other name. This involves working and agreeing on the strategic and conceptual language of such regional rules-based orders that is comprehensible in both countries and the rest of the world. It would involve confidence and security building measures. It would involve core principles of non-violent dispute resolution mechanisms. It would involve also agreeing on regular exercises between the respective militaries of the region on counter-disaster management exercises. These are the sorts of confidence and security building measures that the Europeans put in place with the Soviets back in the 1970s, slowly and gradually building confidence across the divides. We have virtually no such confidence and security building measures and transparency measures currently across the Asian hemisphere. This is a problem for us all. Conflict by miscalculation. Finally, a new US strategic roadmap should seek to include both China and Japan in a new Trans-Pacific Partnership. A genuine free trade area of Asia and the Pacific, as it would ideally become, would help harness all the positive forces of economic globalisation that have helped change much of the region for the better so far. To conclude, there is therefore a rich array of challenges which lie before us. Therefore, the challenges which present themselves to all of us are going to challenge our foreign ministries in the period ahead. I believe, however, the task of creative foreign policy is not to ignore these challenges, but in fact to embrace them head on. Therefore, my argument is that countries like China, like India, like Australia, must work together in managing these challenges of the future. Too often in the past have we had situations in which our engagement with China has been a binary one: friend of China, foe of China, pro-China, anti-China, conflict or kowtow. Surely, in a post-Cold War age, it is time to put this binary nonsense behind us. The complexities are much greater than that. For these reasons, I believe there is a new form, a new third way in which we can engage China on these questions. In previous addresses, I've referred to the principles in the Chinese language of zhengyou, a friendship, best translated, which is based not on subservience, but on candour, on equality, on friendship, on respect, but also a preparedness to speak your mind when it becomes absolutely necessary without doing violence to the fundamentals of a relationship. This concept is alive in the Chinese philosophical tradition. It is one that we should draw on as well as we deal with these profound global and regional challenges which I've referred to in my remarks in this lecture. I look forward to working with our friends in India in responding to these challenges. India has a singular role in dealing with the diplomacy on these questions. I've not sought in this lecture to provide any prescriptions as to the future of India's own relationship with China. My own view is that coming from an Australian political environment, it would be presumptuous to do so. You have achieved your own modus vivendi with China over the last 2,500 years. We have had European settlement in Australia for the last 225 years. The beginning of wisdom is to know what you do not know. However, we do like the opportunity of working with our friends in India, with our friends in China on dealing with these great challenges in an active, proactive diplomacy, not simply sitting by and describing challenges and problems as they arise, emerge and intensify, and perhaps creating circumstances which then become far too difficult to handle for us all. I thank you for the opportunity to deliver this lecture here in Mumbai. I thank the Oberoi Group for sponsoring this lecture. I also thank very much the IISS for the vision which underpins this lecture and the important challenges which are contained within the lecture series which it has so kindly endorsed. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. As one expected, you had a panoramic view of your view of China today. I'll invite questions from the audience. We have some time, but before I do that, let me first ask you two questions. You spoke about the next decade being the decade of Xi, and in passing you referred to the era of unification under Mao and the era of reform under Deng. Mao and Deng resonated at a very different level with the Chinese people because they were in a sense the products of the revolution, they were nation builders, they were for China what Gandhi and Nehru have been for India. Xi for China is like Dr. Manmohan Singh for India, a part of the political system, not the part of a revolutionary movement. So do you think that Xi will have the kind of political clout that a Deng enjoyed or a Mao enjoyed because they led a revolution, while Xi has come out of a bureaucratic process of selection, has been chosen by an elite, many of whom are princelings, and therefore if they fail, they could face much more difficult situations than Tiananmen, which happened when Deng was still alive. So my first question to you is, are you anticipating too much from Xi's decade of leadership? My second question is, I'd be happy if you can say a little more on the transition of China from being number 2 to number 1. I keep going to Beijing. I interact with a lot of senior Chinese officials. And the one message I have come back in the last year from my visits to China is that you now have a leadership in Beijing that already is preparing itself to be world leader. And you yourself said that in the foreseeable future they will become number 1. But there is a consciousness of a generation that sees itself as destined to be number 1. What will a China that sees itself on the rise as destined to be number 1 actually be in its relationship with someone who is today number 1 but likely to become number 2? In other words, what kind of tensions do you see between the United States and China, and what are the implications of that for the region?
Let me answer.
Yeah.
Am I on? Can you hear me back there?
On.
Jolly good. Let me take those two questions in sequence.
It is obvious that you cannot replicate a Gandhi or a Nehru in Indian politics, and it is obvious you can't replicate a Mao or a Zhou Enlai or a Deng in Chinese politics. These are just facts. However, if you look at contemporary Chinese politics, the real question, I believe, is who can be transformational and who will simply manage the status quo. If I look at China's leadership since Tiananmen, I think one of the singular most transformative leaders is the one often least analysed, and that has been Zhurongji and his reforms to the Chinese economy, and the critical and internally controversial decision to join the WTO as a Trojan horse back into the Chinese economy to induce reforms across the system. These were enormously controversial. He was attacked comprehensively for doing it. Of course, as with most people who make the right strategic decisions, history is kind to them, and their contemporaries never are. But if you were to look at the current set of challenges which China faces, and who is on offer to manage those challenges and to be equally transformative, at least to the Chinese growth model for the next period, I think Xi Jinping has the necessary cocktail of experience and background to be equally transformative. The transformation of the new growth model I just referred to before is phenomenally complex. You must admire the Chinese for the preparatory work in which they've engaged on this. This has been the subject of 5 years' worth of work, concluded in large part in the 12th five-year plan, but the rollout is well advanced. His challenge is not one of economic policy, his challenge is one of political economy and actually making the politics work to roll this out. Because in doing so, what is he taking on? He's taking on the enormous vested interests of very large-scale state-owned enterprises within China. But he knows that the only way in which you're going to generate high levels of growth in the future, 25 million new jobs for graduates each year, and to keep living standards rising, is to expand the private sector. You can't expand the private sector if you continue to protect state-owned enterprises. So this is a fundamentally transformative step. Will he succeed or not? Of all his contemporaries, I believe he has the greatest capacity to succeed. Chinese politics is an odd thing. You need to draw upon the strength of family tradition, draw on the evolutionary traditions and contributions of the family, but also be now sufficiently across the broad range of policy debates to be an active policy leader and manager as well, and not simply attend to the broad politics. So I don't have a romantic view of these questions. Xi Jinping and I aren't best pals and buddies who write to each other every weekend. I've met him, long conversations with him, others have as well, and these are the conclusions I've drawn. On your second question about Sino-US relations, what I sought to do in the lecture was indicate that I believe that China's overriding interest for the next 5 to 10 years will be to maintain its stability, even when China passes the United States in size of aggregate size of the economy. They will not achieve anything approaching a comparable standing with the Americans in terms of their military capabilities until mid-century. I mean, China is just dusting off an old Ukrainian aircraft carrier at the moment and taking off from a flat top for the first time. You know from your own traditions with fleet air arms how long these things take. We know from our own traditions with fleet air arms how long these things take. And despite the formidable pace of Chinese military expenditure, America will remain as the military superpower until we get much closer to mid-century. So therefore, sure, we cannot ignore China's becoming an economic superpower. And what I've said before, consistent with the rationale of this series in terms of the influence of geoeconomics, that actually creates foreign policy and security policy influence. But in terms of hard military assets, our friends the Chinese have a long way to go.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Just wait for the mic to come to you. And can we have the lights on in the room, please, so that we can see who we are?
Very well spoken, sir. I've got two quick questions. The first is, would you say in China the politics follows the economy more closely than in other countries? And the second, for example, China's engagement with Africa. And the second is, will the political reform in China be driven more by China's engagement with the world or by its own people because of rising expectations, or it won't change at all?
I'll take a couple of more questions before I. Yes, Ed, you're at the back.
Your Excellency, you made a comment in the last about the Chinese friendship concept, which is respect with candor. But China's demonstration in the last few years is completely antithesis of it. It's muscle flexing with Spratly's Island in Philippines, its Navy's aggressive postures, and the Vietnamese oil fields, and of course the northern frontiers and eastern frontiers of India are absolutely, totally opposite of what you just stated in the evening at the end of your lecture. So China is really flexing its muscle and kind of suggesting the world is to be divided into two. Anything in Asia is China. There will be no number two in Asia, and rest of Atlantic belongs to USA. Is that the end game?
Yes, sir.
So my own belief is, I think for the next 20, 30 years, most countries are going to have much more of an issue dealing with their domestic policy rather than the foreign policy, in the sense that as a rising power, it is clear that China will take over, say, the US. But the fact of the matter is, as we saw in the last 5 years, the crisis is creating a lot of issues in terms of creating jobs in the West. At the same time, China having a very large population as well as a large growing older population, are they, in your expertise over the next 30 years, will be able to create an adequate health care system as people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, which is going to be the case for most human beings on Earth, will be living? At the same time, the younger ones, especially in the US and Europe, are having difficulty finding decent jobs as robotics and automation eat up a lot of the middle class jobs. What is in the Chinese leadership's mind of being able to create those well-paying jobs that would be necessary to keep stability?
Yeah.
Hello? Yeah, Your Excellency, you described a very complex transformation that needs to happen within the Chinese political economy, and talked about Xi Jinping's ability to do this or to assist with this, to facilitate it. But at the same time, at least outside of China in the press, what we're seeing is a huge amount of revelations or backlash around corruption in the Chinese leadership, the term of princelings and so on. How would the leadership in China today for the next 10 years have the credibility to pull off what will cause friction in terms of a transformation?
I think, why don't you answer these and then we'll see if there are more questions.
I feel like I'm sitting a high school exam here. Testing the powers of my memory. Let me try and answer these seriatim to the extent that I can. On the first question about what are the principal determinants in China, politics or economics, we would like to say in a perfect world this is a virtuous cycle, but the truth is, given the nature of the Chinese political system, politics comes first. That is the nature of a revolutionary party, that is the nature of the way in which China has evolved post-49, and when the first object of the Chinese Communist Party as currently conceived is to stay in power, it follows that other questions proceed from that premise. But having said that, the reason why in an age where the Chinese Communist Party is no longer a Marxist party, but is a Leninist party, its ideological legitimacy does not rest on Marxism. It rests on being able to deliver economic outcomes for the majority of people, rising living standards, lifting people out of poverty, plus, when necessary, a sense that this party is returning China to its stage of international greatness. They are the two new bases for legitimacy. On the question of the domestic economy and the international economy being the principal drivers of change, these are not binaries, both are at work. The international slice of Chinese economic activity has grown formidably, China is currently going through the experience of understanding that you will not always have a trade surplus in the world, and this is coming as something of shock to the Chinese political system. But it is still an enormous driver of China's aggregate economic wealth and well-being, reflected in their ownership of international financial assets, including a vast amount of US treasuries. But within the Chinese domestic economic transformation, the core reality is this. They are changing the growth model because they've concluded one thing. Relying on the global market is not of itself the best guarantee to deal with its future. It worked for a period of time for the newly industrial economies of the 70s and 80s across East Asia, the Korean experience, the Taiwanese experience, the Singaporean experience somewhat earlier, and also the Malaysian experience too, the East Asian tigers. But these are economies much smaller in scale than the Chinese economy, and that model also ceased to work for those economies as well. So the Chinese have legitimately concluded that because of those, shall I say, evolutionary factors, plus the unique revolutionary impact of the global financial crisis, which has said that permanent growth in global demand can't be assumed, there has been a further urgency to achieve the transformation to a new growth model based on much higher levels of domestic consumption. On the question about China flexing its muscles, where's my friend who asked that question? There he is there. I couldn't quite hear all of it from here, but I seem to gain the impression that you were saying that you thought I underplayed that in my remarks. I think if I picked that up clearly. Having observed the history of the South China Sea for the last 32, 35 years myself, I'm acutely conscious of the patterns of activity in the South China Sea. China is becoming much more robust in asserting its claims, both diplomatically and militarily. Similarly, responses from those in the South China Sea have been robust as well. When I look at the challenges of Senkaku and Diaoyudao, I see two competing nationalisms at work. I see actually a much more stable environment, based on my discussions most recently in Delhi on the Sino-Indian border, despite what the Indian media prints as being a rolling crisis across the border. I think within the official establishments, both in Beijing and in Delhi, that is not necessarily a shared view. But what's my overall take on these things? China, in its diplomacy, as I've observed it over the last 35 years, has gone from passive to active. China, in its military capabilities, has gone from being an essentially land-based operation with a PLA with a principally domestic function into an international military capability, both in terms of its sea-based systems and its air power as well. And the objectives which ultimately underpin those capabilities has been China's capacity to ultimately use military force if it became necessary over Taiwan. Here is the challenge, however. The capabilities which arise from that contingency then provide the Chinese with a series of other capabilities capable of doing a whole range of other things which people in the region will find destabilizing. Hence why I say we need, frankly, an emerging sense of common security culture in East Asia and the Pacific, basic confidence and security building measures, basic transparencies. This is a very brittle security policy environment, very brittle. And we can either just sit back and wait for things to happen by miscalculation, or we can choose to, frankly, create a different culture to at least minimize the possibility of conflict by miscalculation. Two final quick points on the other questions that were asked. The domestic policy changes. Who asked that question again? Challenges versus the foreign policy challenges. Again, these are not binaries. The Chinese see themselves as having two sets of challenges to face simultaneously, and they must embrace both. They must walk and chew gum at the same time. They don't have the luxury of saying we're just going to do the domestic stuff and forget about our role as a rising great power. They've got to do both. But here's the other reality. In this globalized economy in which we all operate, there is no such thing as an exclusive domestic domain anymore. 50 years ago there may have been, now it is not. I do not know of a single agency of state in my country which is not impacted on a daily basis by the globalizing reality which they face, whether it's from fisheries to communicable diseases through to the traditional statecraft of what the militaries do. And how is China seeking to create jobs for the future and deal with its own demographic challenge, in particular the ageing of its population? 2 quick points. One is get ready for a change in the one-child policy. I think they're moving in that direction. I think they're concerned about where all that takes them in the future. And of course that doesn't remove the ageing factor which therefore emerges from the period 2025 to 2045, but I believe you'll see changes on that policy. And how will they create the jobs? China's number 1, 2 and 3 domestic priority is to invest in education, skills, training, research and scientific innovation. It doesn't matter where you go in China, which city, which municipality, which research institute, the phenomenal state investment in these assets to create, as they say it, the capacities for tomorrow is formidable. On corruption, well, it's a bit like saying, is the Pope a Catholic? The corruption is in China, corruption is in many countries around the world. Xi Jinping has no greater or lesser challenge on that score, I believe, than those who have preceded him in that position. What I note, however, from the political style of his recent presentation in Shenzhen is that he's determined not to simply be seen as one of the political leaders cut off from day-to-day political reality and living purely in a cloistered environment. I think he's seeking to project an image already of being of a different hue to that. Whether he succeeds or not is an open question, but I'm encouraged by the early sign.
Thank you. Yes, Rajiv.
I had a question about the nature of the political economy challenge that this leadership faces versus what Zhu Rongji faced. Zhu Rongji, it is my understanding of the difficulty, internal opposition he faced at the time, was the challenge of breaking the iron rice bowl, protecting employment for a largely urban labor force, which was in state-owned companies. Isn't the problem more of this time around more complex? It's somewhat similar to the political economy of reform here, where you have the Communist Party elites who have now entrenched themselves into the bowels of state-led capitalism or state capitalism. How do you take away their economic interest and make the economy more vibrant and genuinely private sector led?
Well, if I could respond to that quickly and briefly, because if we do it that way, it won't test my memory cells, like the last set of 4 questions did. I think every phase of the Chinese political economy challenge since '78 has been formidable. If you were to embrace the idea in 1978 that you were going to decollectivise agriculture, they would have thought you were mad. If they said that you were going to abolish state controls on prices, they would have thought you were mad. If they thought that you were going to impose on yourself some of the disciplines arising from WTO membership, they would have thought you were mad. But each of these things has been very difficult in its own season, and the politics of reaction have been formidable. But I think what has happened in the last decade is that there is now a wide policy consensus that for the future, which means how do I continue to lift people out of poverty, and how do I continue to create jobs for all these people we've been training at university, and how do I continue to raise and sustain people's living standards, there's now no alternative but to prosecute the next phase of economic reform. The Chinese leadership haven't had a revelationary experience, having spent the night reading Adam Smith and The Wealth of Nations and said, Eureka, we've worked it out and off we go. No, these are very pragmatic people and exceptionally well researched on what now must be done to sustain growth levels in the vicinity of 7 to 8%, create the employment necessary, which can only occur now with a much greater slice for the private sector. On the mechanics of it, For those of you in the IPO business, watch out for some IPOs coming along. I think they're going to be formidable. As to whether you should invest them in or not, it's a separate question. But I think you're going to see a lot of activity there. Large-scale private firms, whether it's in Chinese auto or Chinese manufacturing, who I know quite well personally, they have been feeling the pinch from, shall I say, the dominance of the state sector in those two overall fields of the economy. They are demanding their own economic space. They're saying to the leadership, you want us to create an extra million jobs? Fine, give us the space in the market to do it. Now, is that going to be a challenge of politics in the party? Of course it is, but so is each challenge so far. And here is my final point on this. The last 30 years, I have seen so many analyses written on why the Chinese reform process and the Chinese political process will self-implode. Most of these are what I describe as optimism-driven analysis in the hope that it would. None of them have come to pass, and 35 years later the Chinese are chugging along at a great pace. I therefore see no prima facie cause for concluding that they're going to fail in the next 35 years. This is a very, very methodical process. And when I talk about phase 2 of Xi Jinping possibly being a small p political reform, it's not because they've gone home with a volume of Montesquieu and not because they've taken some Locke home to study and realised that in another eureka moment that the Americans got it right in 1776. No, but they know that the expectations from their own middle class are going to reach a certain breaking point that unless they provide a breakthrough with a certain capacity to reflect a political view within the country other than through the protest literature of the social media, then the system will fracture. So again, for quite pragmatic and well-researched reasons, I believe you will start to see an opening of the system. Not huge, but enough to sustain the political economy of the country.
Yeah, Excellency. Yes, I'm afraid we are running out of time. Just a couple of questions. Yeah, please. I'll come to you 1 minute here.
Hi. I have 2 questions, so a small test.
If you can just ask 1 question each because he has a dinner to go to.
Okay, I'll stick to one. You described this event over the last weekend when he went to Shenzhen and the official Chinese news agency didn't cover it and it was more to the Yoko Tudus and the blogospheres out there. So how do you see social media impacting China politically, socially, and economically?
Let me answer that briefly. For my sins, I'm on Chinese Twitter. And so each night I will go home to my hotel room in some obscure part of the world and tap out my own communications for the day. So I'll describe what I've been doing here. So in the space of the last 6 or 9 months, I now have 700,000 Twitter followers in China. It's a fascinating medium to be involved in because, let me tell you, the reactions from Chinese across the field, whether I think there are 350 million people now involved in Chinese social media, is a fundamental challenge, but also opportunity for the Chinese Communist Party. I think because through it, the Chinese party is seeing the depth and breadth of what's happening with social change in China, upfront and personal, through what's written online. That they also are increasingly recognise that they have to manage political change processes themselves. Do dissidents still get imprisoned in China for attacking the central role of the Chinese Communist Party? Yes, of course they do. That continues to happen. And do we continue to protest about that? Yes, we do, as we should. However, what I find as someone who went to live there 25 years ago and comparing the China of then to the China of today, the level of personal freedom which people have on the questions of their work, their marriage, their points of view on every subject under the sun, this is like moving from on a freedom index of 1 out of 10 to a freedom index of 6.5 out of 10. That's kind of what's happened. But I think the leadership is smart enough to know that they've actually got to continue to open the system further. That will be the hardest thing, harder than frankly, the economic transformation which I referred to before.
Yes, Mr. Singh.
Okay. Excellency, you had mentioned about the security culture to be created in the region. Now, with so many territorial disputes, most of which China is involved, do you think, what kind of security culture do you expect to be created? And does it also mean that we will never have a formal security structure in the Asian region like we have elsewhere?
Well, obviously, China in the region, as I said in the answer to the question from the gentleman at the back, is more assertive both diplomatically and militarily. That's an empirical fact. You observe it. No one's disputing that. But I think looking at the region purely from a Chinese perspective, there is, I think, a high degree of interest in avoiding conflict by miscalculation. Let me take the South China Sea as an example. There are incidents happening out there every day of one description or another. There are up to 8 Chinese government agencies involved on the high seas in the South China Sea at a given time, from fisheries to customs to the PLA Navy to the Coast Guard to whomever, the provincial administration on the islands themselves, the Air Force. There's a very good study done by the International Crisis Group of this only about 6 or 9 months ago, which maps the number of agencies involved. Then you compound that when you go on the other side of the equation in terms of who's also engaging at the Filipino level, who's engaging at the Vietnamese level, etc. This is a very complex set of, shall I say, potentially explosive incidents happening on a daily basis. I think there is a Chinese interest, and I think there's certainly a wider regional interest into bringing about some predictability in how we manage incidents when they occur, rather than simply devolving all management responsibility to some sub-lieutenant on a Coast Guard vessel in the middle of the water. So I think there's a Chinese interest in that. There's certainly a regional interest in it, and I believe from little things, big things can grow. My final point on that is also at a conceptual level. China says that its vision for the world is for a harmonious world, 和谐世界. The Chinese domestic vision has been for a harmonious society, 和谐社会. Now, if you take Chinese concepts of harmony and balance, which deeply inform their philosophical approach to policy questions at home and abroad, and you mesh them with multilateral possibilities within our own region of achieving balanced, reasoned outcomes, there is something to work with at a conceptual level as well. I am not naive on these questions. I'm a deep realist on questions of security policy. But the problem with everyone being capital R realist all the time is that what we plan for tends to happen. That's what worries me. And we need to imagine different futures as well. And I believe there's enough of a constituency in Beijing and in other countries to imagine a different set of alternatives, which is not a security policy in nirvana, but at least minimizes the risks of unintended conflict.
The last question from here.
Sir, it's widely believed that the Chinese success, the economic success is to a large extent due to the artificial value of their currency. And even in the recent American presidential elections, we heard a lot about what the world needs to do to rectify this. Now, if there is some pressure, then will that currency value be rectified? And if so, does it have political, legal, and social consequences?
I think that's an important question coming from Mumbai, the exchange rate policy.
No, exactly. I made one reference to that in my lecture, because I do believe that the new Chinese leadership will embark upon further changes in terms of the possible floating of the renminbi or the yuan. What we've seen over the last several years, I can't remember the precise year it began, was of course the capacity for the valuation of the Chinese yuan to change within a given band over a given period of time. But here's an interesting statistic. Over the last 4 to 5 years, the yuan has effectively appreciated against the US dollar by a factor of about 35%. That is a significant shift over that period of time. You'll notice that the general temperature in the United States on the currency question is less than it was several years ago. Certainly it featured in the presidentials, as it's still a live factor, but it's not its screaming point, which is where it was 5 years ago. Why, therefore, would the Chinese be interested in the further reform to the currency, as opposed to artificially giving yourself a price advantage on international export markets? I think the Chinese have studied these questions deeply, like those engaged in similar macroeconomic policy questions in other countries at that stage of development. And they've worked out that if the next driver of demand in the Chinese economy is domestic consumption, that in fact there is an overall, and from their perspective, counterintuitive wisdom in making imports into the economy less expensive than they currently are, as a further driver of economic activity and growth. Frankly, that's good for the rest of us. Think about it. And I think they have begun to reach these conclusions. The folk who are now emerging into significant policy advisory positions within the central bank, around Zhou Xiaochuan, and those who will replace him, given his term at the bank is coming to a close, I think all Harvard educated, they know the way these things work, they know where they're up to, and they know the next set of changes to occur. So do I expect a full float of the Chinese yuan? Nope. Do I expect what I would describe in Australia in previous decades as a dirty float, that is within a much wider band? Yes, and entirely for Chinese domestic reasons.
Thank you, Mr. Rudd. I'm really grateful to you for spending this hour and a half with a audience that you can see was very interested in hearing you and asking you questions. I want to thank each one of you, because I believe that you've had your time well spent. One of the reasons why I chose to invite Mr. Rudd to Bombay as part of our IISS series is because I have seen from his writings, which incidentally are available on the IISS website, his London lecture, his lecture in Bahrain earlier this week, and also the full version of his lecture this evening. You can go to iiss.org and read all of that. He's one of the most well-informed analysts of China, and I believe that in India we don't pay enough attention to what is happening in China. You mentioned earlier that there are these two extreme views, either China is a friend or a foe, but between these two extreme views, a realist understanding of what's happening is extremely important. It is true that unlike France and Germany, or Britain and France and many of the European countries which fought many wars over the last 500 years, India and China went to war only once in the last 2,500 years, and that was in 1962. But it is also true that the interaction between India and China has been minimal. And we cannot continue in this manner where the level of interaction between our two countries is as little as it actually is. Often people talk about this $60 billion business, but those numbers actually hide the fact that people-to-people interaction is still very low, and a realistic understanding of the nature of transformation in China is still something we do not, I believe, have an adequate grasp of what is happening. And I think it's very, very useful for us to listen to people like you, to read what's happening in China, because China is our neighbor and will continue to play an important role. Certainly in Asia, it's already playing an important role. Even if it doesn't overtake the United States and become #1 power in the world, which I don't see happening in my lifetime, maybe by the middle of the 21st century, but I think the linear analysis which suggests by 2020 or 2030 that would happen. I'm a skeptic of all linear analysis. I think history goes in ups and downs. We have seen a phase of very rapid rise of China. We are likely to see a phase in which I think China will have to stabilize itself politically before it rises again. But whatever happens to China, it's next door to us. And for us in India, it's extremely important that we have an informed view of our neighbor rather than fall into these two boxes of regarding China as, the old days we used to say Hindi Chini bye bye. And from there we have come to a situation today where if you watch Indian television, you'd imagine there's going to be war tomorrow. There's an exaggerated negativism in the media which you referred to. But I think between these two extremes, we have a relationship which is mature. Often it's not recognized that one of the great successes of the current government in the last decade has been to maintain stability, both under Prime Minister Vajpayee and under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. India has actually maintained a stable relationship despite various incidents which could have created problems. We've had a very stable relationship. I'm grateful to you for coming and speaking to us and giving us an idea of the nature of political change underway in China. And I thank each one of you for spending this evening with us. I must add a word of thanks to Mr. PRS Oberoi, Vikram Oberoi, and Devendra Barma and his team in Oberoi, Mumbai, for having worked with us and made this evening possible. I want to thank Ambreen Khan and Associates for also getting the act together this evening, and thank each one of you for coming. Thank you.